Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Berechot, chapter 1, Halacha 3, and this is a really short one. And we're going to be getting into Bet Shammai, Bet Hillel, the classic arguments of the Zugot, and trying to get into finer points of halacha. So Mishnah starts off like this. It says, Bet Shammai says, in the evening, all people must recline and only then recite the Shema. Now, I want to point out here that Yatu is written here for the word recline. Now, it's not writing down Yeshev or something like that to lie. It's really, Yatu has this implication of sort of leaning, and that you're maybe leaning on your side. Maybe you're leaning on your elbows, on your side, or something like that, but it's not written Yeshev. And the Torah commands us to say the Shema, when we lie down and when we arise. And the Gemara is going to now try to figure out, and the oral law is going to try to figure out, when is this? And is this going to be a thing of posture? Now, Bet Shammai is saying, in the evening, all people must recline, and only then recite the Shema. And then the Mishnah continues, says, and in the morning, they must stand while reciting the Shema. Now, that's going to be interesting, because effectively what Bet Shammai is implying is that you're not allowed to say the Shema while you're lying flat. In other words, it has to be this Yatu, which is this form of reclining. That's a fine point. Now, Mishnah continues, says, for in the verse commanding recitation of the Shema, it is stated, when you lie down and when you arise. In other words, what this is trying to teach is that the evening Shema must be recited when reclining, and the morning while standing. So that's, by the way, you can find that in Beurim in chapter 6, pasuk 7. So Bet Hillel is going to say like this in the Mishnah. Bet Hillel says, all people recite the Shema according to their preferred manner. In other words, whatever way one pleases, whether it's going to be standing, reclining, sitting, or walking. That's basically what Bet Hillel is saying. And the Mishnah continues, says, for in regard to recitation of the Shema, it is stated, when you sit in your house and when you go upon the road. And effectively what he's saying by quoting this Torah verse from Devarim 11:19, he's basically trying to prove that even somebody who's neither reclining nor standing may say the Shema. So the Mishnah is now going to deal with how Bet Hillel deals with the verse that Bet Shammai quoted. This is going to be in Devarim 6:7. Bet Shammai is hanging his hat on the verse that says, when you lie down and when you arise. So we want to know, how does Bet Hillel treat this? Mishnah says like this, it says, if so, why is it stated when you lie down and when you arise? In other words, according to Bet Hillel, the verse does not refer to one's position during the recitation of the Shema. And the Mishnah continues, is saying, rather, it's establishing the proper times for reciting the Shema, teaching that it must be done at the time people are lying down asleep and at the time people are rising from their beds. In other words, Bet Shammai is saying that the verse means that it's trying to establish a proper time for saying Shema, and it could have said in the evening, in the morning, and Bet Shammai is reading it that this expression of when you lie down and when you arise is also to be understood as the position somebody has when they're saying the Shema. So the Gemara now is very short, and it's going to get into this dispute. And the Mishnah was talking about how Bet Hillel is trying to sort of address Bet Shammai's proof. So the Gemara is going to address the issue. Gemara says, now those of Bet Hillel explained both verses, that one supports their own view as well as the one that could be construed as supporting Bet Shammai's view. Gemara says, but how do those of Bet Shammai explain the verse, when you sit in your house and when you go upon the road, which seems to indicate that even one who is neither reclining nor standing may say the Shema? In other words, they're flipping it over from what the Mishnah says. Well, they're saying, forget about how Bet Hillel's addressing Bet Shammai's verse. They want to know, how does Bet Shammai address Bet Hillel's verse? And the Gemara is going to answer that. It's going to say, according to Bet Shammai, that verse in Devarim 11, in chapter 11, 19, is answering. It says, according to Bet Shammai, when you sit in your house, comes to exclude those who are engaged in the performance of mitzvahs from the requirement of saying the Shema. And the phrase, and when you go down to the road, comes to exclude bridegrooms from this requirement. So Bet Shammai has an answer. Bet Shammai has an answer. And Haredim points out that the expression, when you sit, beshiv techa, one expression, as opposed to beshevet, when you're sitting, is basically, this is what the Haredim is implying, that we're saying that, the Shema, requirement is limiting to one who is involved with personal matters, like you're sitting, and one who is involved in mitzvahs, which are going to be a sacred matter to heaven, is excluded from the Shema requirement. That's how the Haredim is looking at that, and that's a very keen point. Beshevet has a different implication. So the way the words are phrased really does matter here. Now the Haredim is going to say about this second part about the bridegrooms and the road. It's going to say that and when you go is going to be different than and when going, and that's going to provide another indication that the Shema requirement is going to be limited to one who is involved with his own personal matters and not one who's involved in mitzvahs. Now, that the wording here about uvlechet is a little bit different. It could be uvlechtecha, and it's just you have subtle differences here in the wording and on what's not said, and they're trying to pull out in the way this is constructed meaning on how this mitzvah is going to go. The Haredim points out that although a bridegroom's exemption from the recitation of the Shema is due to his preoccupation with the mitzvah, it cannot be derived from the general exclusion of those who are occupied in mitzvahs when you sit, but requires an exclusionary clause on its own, to say, and when you go. And on the basis of the first clause alone, we would have exempted only those who are actively involved in the mitzvah, but one who is not mentally preoccupied with its eventual performance, and hence the need for a second exclusionary clause. And that's the note by the Haredim about this. So there's a lot going on in the Torah on the way that these are phrased for how we interpret halacha. Now, there's going to be a Baraisa dealing with this dispute between Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai, and here's how this Baraisa goes for this dispute. It was taught in a Baraisa. There was once an incident with Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and Rabbi Yishmael, in which they were staying at a certain place, and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was reclining while Rabbi Yishmael was upright. When they designated the time to recite the morning Shema, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah stood upright, intending to recite the Shema while standing in accordance with Bet Shammai's opinion. And when Rabbi Yishmael immediately reclined, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said to Rabbi Yishmael, your behavior is analogous to the following. One says to someone in the market, why have you grown your beard so long? And he replies, let it be a protest against those who destroy their beards. The Gemara continues and says, similarly, when the time for reciting the Shema arrived, I, who had been reclining, stood upright, and thus emulated you. But you, who had been upright, immediately reclined. Did you simply wish to make a protest against me? And Rabbi Yishmael said to him, you stood upright in accordance with the word of Bet Shammai, whereas I reclined in accordance with the words of Bet Hillel. In other words, with the people who follow the halacha of Bet Hillel. So, if you were going to say, effectively what he's implying is that he's effectively saying that if you would, make this reply that it's unnecessary for me to recline, since Bet Hillel agrees that one is allowed to recite the morning Shema while standing. The Gemara has another point. The Gemara continues, says, I will provide another reason for my reclining. I did this so that the students should not see me standing and construe this as an endorsement of your act, and on that basis establish the halacha in accordance with the word of Bet Shammai. In other words, if he reclined, it could give the opinion that he was actually going by Bet Shammai. Now, the Haredim explains this incident as follows, and then the Gemara will be over. Basically, it says that the Haredim points out that Rabbi Yishmael meant to say that I had been standing earlier, not in anticipation of reciting the Shema while upright as you thought, but simply because it was convenient for me to stand at that time. And had you remained reclining, I would have remained standing, since Bet Hillel maintains that you can say the Shema in any position. And when you, however, stood up specifically to abide by the opinion of Bet Shammai, I demonstrated my disagreement with your view and reclined. Now, if they had done this in private, I simply would have informed you that I disagree. But since there were students present, says the Haredim, he found it necessary to demonstrate the rejection of the practice, and had he remained standing, they may have all gained the impression that both of them follow Bet Shammai's opinion in actual practice, and this would have caused them to embrace Bet Shammai's opinion as actual law. So this incident must have occurred before they have this bat kol that went out to proclaim the halacha following Bet Hillel. That's a key point about this. There was a bat kol that went out and said, oh, the halacha is going to be by Bet Hillel, except in 26 cases. But the issue here is that they didn't want to confuse the students, and that's something that we can learn about today. How important Morris Ein is, and that you're supposed to if you're going to be Haredi, you have to go in a certain way, and really you have to be very sensitive about the people around you and who sees you, because sometimes if you're doing something that can confuse people, you got to be very careful about it, not to confuse people that are less learned than you. So that's what this is teaching about, how careful we have to be with Morris Ein.